All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I've got Aaron Maté, and he's, of course, at the Gray Zone, and he's got his very own Substack as well, which is Maté, just spelled like mate, Maté.substack.com. And at both places, you can see his new piece. With Clinton lawyer charged, the Russiagate scam is now indicted. Welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I'm good, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. Really happy to have you here. I'll tell you what, I agree with you that this Russiagate thing is important. It seems like maybe kind of it's not, because Trump isn't the president anymore, and they dropped it, quite a while ago. All the accusations, I guess 2009 was mostly the last hurrah for the thing. And it seems like it's kind of going to the memory hole. Some stuff that happened, but what's the big deal, Aaron? What do you think?
Well, it's true that it's kind of gone away, but I think the reason why is because it served its political function, which was basically to constrain Trump from deviating too much from the bipartisan national security consensus that he challenged when he ran, at least rhetorically, on the campaign trail in 2016, when he criticized, U.S. policy in Iraq and Syria. And it also served its political function in basically letting the Clinton-Biden wing of the party avoid any kind of reflection and responsibility for their loss in 2016 by blaming it all on some giant Russia conspiracy. And now that Trump is gone, it just doesn't have the same political utility anymore. But unfortunately for the people who perpetrated Russiagate, there's now this investigation ordered under Trump into the origins of the Russia investigation that's being carried out by John Durham. And we need some, for people who care about accountability, weaponizing the intelligence community to undermine an elected president and perpetrating this, multi-year psyop against the U.S. population to convince them that Russian bots were invading the country, and the reason why we have Donald Trump is not because of a dysfunctional society, but because of Vladimir Putin's machinations. It's important that we get some accountability. And as part of that, Michael Sussman, this Clinton attorney, just got indicted for something pretty serious. The case shows that it's new evidence that there was a deliberate scam plot perpetrated by the Clinton campaign to basically manufacture the appearance of Trump-Russia ties.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to ask you about that in just 1 second, but I got to add in here too, though, that I wholeheartedly agree with you that even the investigation itself, I mean, these aren't your exact words, but the investigation itself was part of the plot against him when, as we know now from all the late releases of documents, that the FBI was already satisfied how untrue all this was before they went on with the special counsel investigation. And then they carried on the special counsel investigation for 2 full years before letting the American people know that, we're not pursuing an angle that the president of the United States is a Russian agent. We don't see any evidence of that. And remember when Jason Leopold put out a story about Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, Trump told him to lie to Congress, and that's impeachable, and that's going to be a big one. And then Mueller put out a statement saying that's not true. But then, and that was the first real time he had commented, Mr. Tight-Lips, on the investigation for 2 years straight. But then, if he can debunk that, then he could have let the American people know that he was not investigating, that the trail had not led to the idea or the fact or the suspicion that the president of the United States was a pro-Russian traitor who was sitting in the chair behind the Resolute desk in command of our nuclear submarines. And that it's not right. He could have said that all along. Well, we're going after some low-hanging fruit online to the FBI about inconsequential matters. But rest assured, American people, your president is not guilty of treason. He didn't say that. He waited 2 years to say that. And that, to me, goes to show the nature of the entire thing here. That it was all meant, the investigation itself was part of the plot against him. They weren't looking for facts. They were hemming him in by having the investigation itself. And in fact, that's what the FBI told CNN. Well, if we can't remove him with the 25th Amendment, at least we can hem him in. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Schumer said it best just shortly before Trump was inaugurated in January 2017. He went on the Rachel Maddow show, and they were talking about how Trump was basically raising questions about the Russian hacking allegations. And Schumer said that, you shouldn't mess with the intelligence community because they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you, So that's what was happening. It's not like the intelligence community was offended by Trump's, sexism or his racism. They just saw him as an unsuitable steward of the U.S. war machine, and he wasn't a member of the club, and he actually was saying some uncomfortable things about members of the club, like the Clintons and the Bush family. I mean, he humiliated 2 political dynasties while also criticizing things like the interventions in Libya and Syria, and both to constrain that and constrain his behavior in office, and also to stigmatize his criticisms of the national security state. It was very convenient to basically attribute his entire presidency to Russia, to make it seem as if you're saying the things he's saying, then now all that's Russia propaganda. It was it was basically a disinformation effort aimed at the American public to, stoke fear of Russia and undermine the inconvenient parts of Trump's presidency for the bipartisan war machine. And that perfectly dovetailed with Democrats who were just humiliated that they lost to this reality TV show host, this buffoon, this guy who was not a member of the club. So for just a huge array of powerful interests, there was a convergence of motives here, and so they kept it going exactly as you say, just not because they were genuinely investigating anything, because there was no Russia conspiracy. I mean, try to find even any Russians in Russiagate. In terms of actual contacts between Trump campaign people and Russians, there's Konstantin Kilimnik, who was working for a long time with Paul Manafort as his business associate in Ukraine, and their policy actually was pro-Western. They were trying to move Ukraine away from Russia's orbit. And also, Kilimnik himself has deep State Department ties. He was in regular contact with a bunch of U.S. officials, including all the supposed polling data that was like, there was a certain point in which that was like the smoking gun proof, supposedly, of collusion. Mm-hmm. Kilimnik was sending all that polling data to U.S. colleagues as well, just to talk about the campaign. And he was trying to argue that Trump wasn't.
I hadn't heard that angle, that he was sending the same stuff to all others. And this is the same guy, correct, who had worked at the International Republican Institute, led by John McCain, correct?
He spent 10 years at the IRI, heading their Moscow office. Mm-hmm. And so, according to the Russiagate narrative, now all of a sudden we have to believe that a guy who was working for a congressionally funded organization, headed by, John McCain, chaired by John McCain, and then was also in regular contact with the State Department, was a trusted, informant for the State Department, who would actually meet with him about Ukrainian politics.
Oh, man, I wish I had my sound bites queued up where I could play John McCain saying, "We can vet these guys. We know how to vet these guys." Or he's talking about Syria, of course. But, if John McCain can vet somebody, then this Kilimnik guy is not a Russian spy.
Well, in this case, we're supposed to believe that this guy was secretly a Russian spy, which is so even though there's zero evidence for it, and all the evidence that they put forward for it is a joke. And actually, some of the evidence they put forward is false. As I reported earlier this year, they said, Mueller is like big proof that Kilimnik might be associated with Russian intelligence. Of course, Mueller didn't even directly allege it. He just insinuated. He said that this guy has Russian intelligence ties, which, whatever that means. I mean, ties is the most ambiguous thing you can say. But his big piece of evidence was that Kilimnik traveled to the U.S. on a Russian diplomatic visa in 1998. That's one of the big pieces of evidence that Mueller has. I showed that to be false. I got Kilimnik's actual visa from that exact date, and it was a regular U.S. visa. And when I followed up with the State Department to try to get the record of the visa to see who was, like what happened here, they told me that record had been destroyed. They don't have it anymore. So the State Department record of Kalimnik's visa doesn't exist anymore, and the visa I have, which was Kalimnik's, says it's a regular passport. So that's what Mueller had. And on this polling data thing, there's a footnote in the Mueller report, which is where so many of the interesting tidbits are. A footnote acknowledges that Kalimnik sent this polling data that caused so much dumb Russiagate controversy to all these State Department American contacts. But of course, that's inconvenient information to the narrative, so it just gets ignored. But like the point is, Russiagate barely had any Russians because the whole thing was a scam, and so they kept it going for way longer, for way longer than it should have. And first of all, it never should have happened in the first place. The opening of the investigation was ridiculous, but they knew early on they had nothing. And at a certain point, Mueller switched it to obstruction of justice because they knew they had nothing on collusion or conspiracy. So then it became, did Trump obstruct justice? And of course, what happened in the end? They also knew they had no obstruction case, but of course they couldn't say that because that would then make their whole exercise look even more ridiculous. So they just declined to issue a call on it, and they claimed some weird interpretation of of the law and the rules that it wouldn't be fair to Trump to accuse him of obstruction of justice because a sitting president can't be indicted. It was just such a farce, but it served its purpose. Trump was hamstrung. He, to the extent he was serious about pursuing better ties with Russia, he certainly didn't. His administration radically increased tensions with Russia with other policies, as we've talked about before, and he was ultimately defeated. So it served its purpose. But again, now we still have to deal with all the stuff that happened and all the dirty tricks that were pulled to make this thing look genuine. And this Durham indictment is the first sign, really, of some accountability in that direction.
Yeah. Hey, y'all, check out our great stuff at libertarianinstitute.org/books. First of all, we've published No Quarter, The Ravings of William Norman Grigg, our Institute's late and great co-founder. He was the very best one of us. Our whole movement, I mean. And No Quarter will leave his mark on you, no question. Which brings us to the works of our other co-founder, the legendary libertarian thinker and writer Sheldon Richman. We've published 2 collections of his great essays, Coming to Palestine and What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. Both are instant classics. I'm proud to say that Coming to Palestine is surely the definitive libertarian take on Israel's occupation of the Palestinians. And Social Animals certainly ranks with the very best writings on libertarian ethics, economics, and everything else. You'll absolutely love it. Then there's me. I've written 2 books, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've also published a collection of the transcripts of all of my interviews of the heroic Dr. Ron Paul, 29 of them, plus a speech by me about how much I love the guy. It's called The Great Ron Paul. You can find all of these at libertarianinstitute.org/books. All right, now, I really wish you would write a book about this, because there's so much to,
Yeah.
In the very origins of this thing, it seems, if I understand it right, based on, especially Taibbi's work about the Cambridge Four and all of that stuff, it really does seem to me that this all kind of started with an FBI disinformation program in the very first, but like the very first people to even utter the word Russia or have anything to do with any of that was essentially people who were trying to set up the Trump people. I mean, Trump had said, well, we want to get along with Russia and things like that. So the topic had been raised, obviously. But, it's really difficult if you don't just, keep a Russiagate calendar on your desk when you have 10,000 stories coming out from all different directions like this, to keep the timeline really tight on where exactly all of this story came from in the first place. And it seems like at least a very significant part of it really came directly out of the Clinton campaign and the lawyers that they hired. But which parts? And I think this is one of the major things that we're learning about now, right, is on this Alpha Bank supposed scandal. This is one that they just kind of made up, it seems like, right?
Yeah, look, first of all, for all the major components of Russiagate, you have a Democratic Party tie. You have a Democratic Party um, uh, basically like you have someone from the Democratic Party generating the allegations. So collusion that comes from that comes from Fusion GPS in April 2016. The Clinton campaign hired Fusion GPS to do the Steele dossier, and which just like a fabricated collection of so-called intelligence reports alleging this ridiculous Trump-Russia longstanding blackmail conspiracy relationship. And Democratic Party operatives also generated this whole fear-mongering about Russian social media bots. Facebook initially reviewed, Russian memes and accounts on its pages, and it concluded that it was just basically commercial activity, just normal troll farm activity, like targeting certain demographics to build an audience. And then the Russian hacking allegation, the allegation that Russia hacked the DNC server and gave the emails to WikiLeaks, that came from CrowdStrike, another Democratic Party contractor, also hired in April 2016, the same month that they hired Fusion GPS. And so this Durham indictment gives us a window into the collusion part, because not long after Fusion GPS was hired to do the Steele dossier, Michael Sussman, who is an attorney at Perkins Coie, which is the firm that hired Fusion GPS on the Clinton campaign's behalf, Michael Sussman began working with this unnamed tech executive to basically pursue this theory that Trump and Russia were secretly communicating via a bank server, between a server associated with the Trump organization and a server used by Alpha Bank, which is a major bank in Russia. And what comes out from this Durham indictment is that the tech executive worked with a team of researchers to, put together data that could make this theory look credible. But the team doing this themselves expressed doubts. They said that we said that there's really nothing here, and that if people subject this to scrutiny, they're going to know that there's nothing to see here. And even this tech executive acknowledged that the whole thing was a red herring. But they still pursued it, and Michael Sussman still then went to the FBI in September 2016 and presented it to them as if this was all credible, and said that this team of concerned cybersecurity researchers had come to him after uncovering this troubling web traffic between Trump and Alpha Bank. And so he was giving it to the FBI in the hopes that they would investigate it, while also, we're talking to the media in the hopes that the media would report it. So it's clear that this was part of an effort to both plant this one more Trump-Russia story in the FBI and also plant it in the media before the election. And that's what happened, because shortly before the election, a reporter at Slate called Franklin Foyer, who's now at The Atlantic, put out this big story about this Trump-Russia bank server. And the New York Times also reported on it too. And then as soon as they did, the Clinton campaign came out with a statement saying, look, it looks as if cybersecurity researchers have uncovered a Trump-Russia bank server, and the Trump administration has to answer. This was put out by Hillary Clinton on Twitter, and Jake Sullivan, who's now the national security advisor, put out a statement too. But what they were concealing is that they had planted this story. So this was a scam. And where it now becomes criminal is that Sussman's been indicted by John Durham for concealing from the FBI that he was really acting on behalf of the Clinton campaign and like billing them for his time, while instead claiming he was just there, just sharing information he had come across and was not doing this for any partisan purpose. And it also becomes potentially criminal because Alpha Bank alleges, this hasn't been subject to a criminal indictment yet, but Alpha Bank alleges that some of this purported web traffic between a Trump server and Alpha Bank was spoofed. It was concocted. And regardless, I mean, whether it was concocted or not, the theory is so dumb, because really the web traffic, whether it was genuine or not, it wasn't even between a Trump server. It was between a server that the Trump campaign uses for marketing, for like to spend spam emails about its hotels. So whatever it is, the link was extremely tenuous. Now, it might even have been fabricated, but regardless, there was nothing there. And for the first time, we're getting in a indictment, we're getting an act to do with the Trump-Russia investigation. We're getting an actual conspiracy, not the conspiracy involving Trump and Russia, because none existed, but a conspiracy to gin up the appearance of a Trump-Russia conspiracy by Clinton campaign affiliated actors.
And what was the date on when they first started shopping this story around?
They were discussing it amongst themselves in July and August of 2016. And that's when, Steele was working on his dossier. That's when Fusion GPS still started reaching out to the FBI, trying to get them to investigate Trump-Russia ties and get them to look into what they were supposedly uncovering.
And that was when the CrowdStrike accusations came out too.
All this happened at the same time. So basically, in April 2016 is when Perkins Coie hires Perkins Coie hires Fusion GPS to do the Steele dossier. That same month, later on, is when the DNC supposedly discovers that it's been hacked. And at the very end of April, the firm CrowdStrike is hired by Perkins Coie, not the DNC directly, but also by Perkins Coie, to investigate the supposed hack. And in June 2016 is when CrowdStrike comes out with the allegation that Russia hacked the DNC. And so it's just all very coincidental that the same month that Perkins Coie hires Fusion GPS to investigate Trump's supposed Russia ties is when Perkins Coie also hires CrowdStrike, who soon after comes out with the allegation that Russia was behind the hacking of the DNC. And as we've talked about before, it wasn't until May 2020, after Russiagate was pretty much over, after all the investigations were over, that we learned that CrowdStrike privately did not have any evidence that these alleged Russian hackers actually took anything off the server, because in December 2017, CrowdStrike Sean Henry went before the House Intelligence Committee, and he admitted under oath that CrowdStrike did not have any concrete evidence that any data was stolen off the server, any data was actually exfiltrated. All they had was, in his words, circumstantial evidence. But that testimony was buried throughout the entirety of Russiagate, and we only got it in May 2020, so nearly 3 years after Sean Henry admitted it under oath.
Well, now, I'm confused because I know it was April Glaspie Day. That's how I remember. It was July 25th, 2016 was when I interviewed the computer security expert Jeffrey Carr, who debunked all of this stuff then. But I'm trying to remember why it took me until July 25th if the accusations originally came out in June.
Because it's probably because right around then is when WikiLeaks released the DNC emails. And so
I get that must have been it. Yeah, and then that was when Carr started talking about it. But so people can go and find that interview in the archive, and it's, the guy's a A-level computer security expert, and he says, let me tell you something. No one on Earth can examine a server and tell you exactly who broke into it. That's not how it works. Okay?
Exactly.
And then he said, but there's one organization who can tell you exactly what happened here, and only one, and that's the National Security Agency, because they monitor the entire internet. And if it was a Russian at the GRU going through 15 different, VPNs and whatever it was, they can rewind the whole internet and go back and look at a part they weren't watching before if they want to. They have total control over it. They built the thing, or participated in the building of it from the ground up, and have all their backdoors into everything. And they can tell you for sure who done it. And then, as I know, because this has been a whole other level of your argument, another major piece of your argument is when you look at the Reality Winner document and you look at even the John Brennan intelligence assessment that they put out 3 days before Trump's inauguration there, they admit that the National Security Agency only gives this narrative medium confidence. In other words, whatever you guys say, but we're not vouching for it. So, I mean, there you have it right there.
Yes. And so, by the way, and guess who hired CrowdStrike to investigate the DNC server.
Hillary's lawyer, right? Didn't you just say that? That it was
But guess who specifically it was? It was Michael
Sussman?
Sussman. It
Yeah.
was Michael Sussman. So the
Amazing.
same guy who had just been indicted for lying to the FBI
Right.
about who he was working for when he came to them with this scam narrative about Trump Alpha Bank ties is the same guy who hired CrowdStrike to investigate the DNC server, and which shortly afterwards came out with the allegation that Russia did it. And look, the allegation that Russia did it had a very useful purpose. It served because when the emails came out, they were embarrassing to Hillary and the Clinton campaign, the DNC. They showed that the DNC was basically biased against Bernie Sanders, that Hillary Clinton was saying one thing in public, but then another thing to Wall Street behind closed doors. And so when all this came out, by accusing Russia of doing this, it flipped the narrative from being about the contents of the emails to about being this like foreign-led, espionage campaign trying to undermine Hillary and stop her advance to the White House.
Right.
So and this was while secretly the Clinton campaign was paying for research to gin up fake ties between Trump and Russia. So there are just so many coincidences here. So look, it's possible that Russia did it and that it's just a coincidence at the same time that the CrowdStrike caught Russia doing it. The Clinton campaign was the same people were also hiring Christopher Steele to write fake reports tying Trump to Russia. It's possible, but given how much fraud there's been to perpetuate the Russiagate scam, given how many so-called bombshells have consistently fallen apart because they're based on lies, I just, and given how many times evidence has come out that undermines the official story. I mean, every single time I've gone through it, like the Mueller report, when it came out, you read it closely, they show that they're not actually all that confident in the Russian hacking claims. They start using qualified language. They say that, Russia appears to have stolen the emails. They don't say Russia stole the emails. Their timeline doesn't make sense. So, Julian Assange came out and said that he had Hillary Clinton related emails in early June 2016. And then according to the Mueller report, it's only after then that Julian Assange first makes contacts with Guccifer 2.0, who Mueller suggests gave Assange the emails. So according to Mueller's timeline, Assange would have had to have announced that he has the emails before he made contact with the entity that gave the emails to him. And of course, we know that Mueller doesn't even know for sure that Guccifer 2.0 gave Assange the emails, because he acknowledges that it's possible that Assange got the emails directly through an intermediary in person. So Mueller has no idea how Assange actually got the emails. And he doesn't know. And as Sean Henry admitted, they actually have no idea if even these alleged hackers, whoever they were, even took anything off the server. So there's just so many holes in the story. And now you have the fact that you have a Clinton lawyer who hired CrowdStrike, which generated a hacking allegation, now being indicted for lying to the FBI while he was pushing a scam, ginning up fake Trump-Russia ties. It's just one more piece of evidence that this whole thing was a scam. And, hopefully we'll get a report from Durham giving us more detail, because there's so much we still don't know. For example, I've been trying to get the CrowdStrike reports for many years now from the U.S. government, because the public has never been able to see the reports that CrowdStrike did. They did at least 3. Like, what is the basis for their attribution to Russia here? What is the basis for their claim that Russia hacked the emails? Supposedly they're in these reports, but the public has never been able to see them. Why can't we see them? And I've been trying to get them.
Comey say that, well, the FBI didn't really examine this stuff. We just took CrowdStrike's word for it and went from there.
He basically did say that. He said, normally we don't like to do this, but my people told me that they're a very respected cybersecurity company, and that, they gave us a copy of the server, so we didn't need to really go in. But yeah, he admitted that normally it's not how we do things.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they did basically. Well, you know what? We don't know the full extent of what they relied on, how they relied on CrowdStrike, because we have not been able to see any of the underlying evidence. We know that CrowdStrike was used, but we just don't know what they found and what the FBI relied on, what they didn't, because the evidence has been kept from us. So why? The question is, Why can't we see it for ourselves? So one thing I hope we get out to the public are these CrowdStrike reports. Let's see them.
Yeah.
Let's see what this private company found.
Yeah. Hey, Jason Leopold, there's some redemption for you, buddy. Mr. Foya Ninja. Get that stuff released, man. Now, so I was talking on the phone with a friend of mine the other day, and we were joking about how Trump is such a dummy that he never once, Mr. Twitter, never one time said, hey, look, everybody, even the Liberal Nation magazine, aka you, says that I'm not guilty, that this Russia stuff is BS. Go read it. He never once said that because he didn't know that because, the Nation is a periodical. That was what Anthony said. Well, the Nation's a periodical. He doesn't know about stuff like that. That whole time. And, Ray McGovern had said back during the time that all he should do, he's the president of the United States, he should just declassify everything. I don't know. This never got any coverage. And damn Bob Woodward for waiting to put it in his book. He should have put this in the Post immediately. But it's in the first Woodward book on Trump. I think Rage is the title of it. No. I forgot. Rage is the second one. Anyway, but he says in there, Trump's lawyer, Dowd, said to Trump, as soon as he's inaugurated, I guess, he said, or as soon as the special counsel takes over, that's what it is. So in March or so, 17. He says, listen, Trump, is there anything to this Russia stuff at all that I need to know about here? And Trump is like, hell no, the whole thing is stupid. And his lawyer says, okay, I'm going to give everything we have, all of the campaign documents, every scrap of paper. I'm going to turn it all over to the special counsel. And Trump goes, fine, do it. Which that right there is like, oh man, if that had been part of the narrative all along, then that would have been different. And instead, they just buried that part of it. No one ever really discussed that part of it, where Trump said, give them everything because they hoped that would get them off their back. But then when that didn't work, he's still the president. He could have fired every single person. He could have fired the top 15 people at the Justice Department. And then at the same time, as Ray McGovern urged him to do, declassify everything. Hand it right over to the Times, the Post, the Journal, and Politico, and NPR, and tell them, do your worst. And give it all to them. But shut down the investigation. You only get to be president for 4 years, probably. You're a guy like Trump. You're not going to let them do a special counsel investigation against you for years like this. But he did, because that's what a dummy he is. When all he had to do was fire Mueller, but then order everything released so that the people can judge for themselves, because he knew all along, just as you and I knew all along, that it wasn't true. So what the hell did he have to lose to do it that way? But he's just too dumb to have thought it through. He was too busy yelling at somebody to think about it,
Well, I don't actually agree with you. I don't think he was too dumb. I think a few things here. First of all, if he had fired Mueller, someone else would have taken over. I mean, as soon as the special counsel is appointed, that's an investigation. That's a special counsel investigation, whether Mueller is leading it or not. So, in the same way that firing Comey was, didn't really actually probably prolong the Russia investigation, which I think Trump even knew it would. But I think, look, there's a few things. One, I mean, yeah, you're right. His lawyers advised him just to cooperate fully because they knew there was nothing there, and they tried that. What they didn't maybe anticipate is that the Mueller team and people like Andrew Weissman, they weren't there to do an actual investigation. They were there to basically try to lend some credibility to this fake Russiagate narrative. Because in the case of Andrew Weissman, especially, I mean, he's a partisan hack. I mean, now he's an analyst at MSNBC, and he's repeatedly fueled the collusion and innuendo by being dishonest. And he brought all these really stupid prosecutions that were totally baseless, as all of them were. Just, getting people on trivial perjury charges or whatever, going after Manafort for his Ukraine finances, which had nothing to do with Trump or Russia, but they tried to make it look as if it was. And so, this investigation would have gone on regardless. And I think the strategy of full cooperation was actually smart because it made, it gave the Mueller team sort of they couldn't complain that Trump wasn't being cooperative because, as you say, they were. They gave him everything. They even let Trump's lawyer, speak to Mueller, and that's actually who became Mueller's key witness in an attempt to fuel obstruction stuff. But of course, that didn't even work in the end because they knew they had nothing there. Because, as they also had to acknowledge, Trump wasn't guilty of the underlying crime that was being investigated, which was a conspiracy with Russia. But also, in terms of him being stupid, I just think he was scared. I think he got intimidated, and I think the constant impeachments, where he needed to, keep the support of some Republicans to keep him in office. I think he just got, far from being stupid, I think he got just sufficiently intimidated into going along. And he knew that if he declassified, he would provoke the ire of the national security state, and they could hurt him. As we talked about before, Chuck Schumer said, the intelligence community is 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. And I think that was very much on his mind. I think he wanted to, at least last one term.
Yeah.
And maybe he even was concerned for his safety. It's not unreasonable given, the power of the national security state. And there's been reporting that's come out since. After Trump left, I interviewed Kash Patel, who was a senior official in the Trump administration, had a bunch of different roles. And, before joining the administration, he was a staffer on the House Intelligence Committee. And it was basically his work that helped unearth, along with his colleagues, that helped unearth the surveillance abuses in the Carter Page investigation, where the FBI was basically relying on the Steele dossier to spy on Carter Page and concealing the fact that it was paid for by the Clinton campaign from the FISA court. So it was Kash Patel who found that out. And then Patel went on to serve in the Trump administration, and he was instrumental in getting out a bunch of material, of declassifying a lot of information. But there was some stuff that he wanted declassified that other people like Gina Haspel, Mark Esper, other officials fought. And basically, after a long standoff, Trump sided with the people who didn't want to declassify, even though obviously it would help Trump, his public narrative. But ultimately, he backed down. And this was at the very end of his administration. So this was even after, the two after the first impeachment had failed, but this was while the second impeachment was going on. So I just think he was trying to preserve himself and not piss off too many powerful people. I think that was the main motive. And even at the end, when he ordered stuff declassified, all of it didn't get publicly released. Somehow John Solomon, who's a conservative journalist, got some of it, but a lot of it didn't get out. And so I don't attribute that to stupidity. I just attribute that to him being scared.
Yeah, well, on this and a lot of other things, he never could close the deal. Never could It seems to me, like my example of him never once tweeting out your articles in The Nation goes to show that he didn't even have a guy on his staff who was in charge of telling him, what's the latest on the Russiagate hoax. You know what I mean? He wasn't even up to date on what the hell was going on with the thing,
Well, I agree with that. I agree that his administration, he was hated by the Republican establishment. So the people willing to work for him, it was a pretty small pool, and they weren't very experienced. I mean, you talk to people who were on his 2016 campaign, and basically that was just Trump freestyling. It was mostly just Trump. Everything was just off, and so it wasn't a very smooth operation. And in terms of tweeting out my articles, the problem from their point of view is I also every time would make a partisan argument too, that I thought all this Russiagate stuff was actually a big gift to Trump, because it was turning his resistance into a bunch of conspiracy crazed, deranged, fanatics.
True, but look, I mean, Mueller, if I'd been on his staff, I'd have been saying, "Boss, you gotta tweet this. That even The Nation admits it's all a hoax." And type it in all capital letters and then tweet that out 6 times. Are you crazy? I don't care what else Maté, what other point he makes in there about universal health care, whatever it is, Because that's the whole point, right? Here's a guy who's not a Trump guy, who is also not going to sit here and carry water for the FBI and the CIA and the Clinton campaign when they're lying about the elected president. And this was the thing that people should have got right away, is that no matter what you think of Trump, he won an election. The FBI and the CIA, they're not even described in the Constitution anywhere. They are to be subordinate to him
Hmm.
Full stop, period. You don't, this is like a COINTELPRO op that they would launch against the Black Panthers in Oakland, and they did to the President of the United States. That's absolutely intolerable, no matter who the president is. And if they'd done the same thing to Hillary Clinton, I'd have took her side, which
I
is
totally
really
agree.
saying something, because I'm a
I
really
to-
anti-Hillary guy.
I totally agree, and it's a point that unfortunately a lot of people couldn't process because they were so consumed by fear of Trump and the shock of him winning, and so the Russiagators took advantage of that, took advantage of people's fear of Trump, and they used it to normalize a really cynical playbook where you're weaponizing the national security state to undermine the elected president, whatever you think of him, you know. It sets a very dangerous precedent. And look what happened to progressives, and this is exactly what people like me and Max Blumenthal were warning about during the 2020 primary when Bernie Sanders was, doing well early on. He was, it was very early on, and so on the eve of the Nevada caucuses, what happened? We got this leak saying that Vladimir Putin wants to install Bernie Sanders, and that predictably, helped, stir this frenzy about, Putin and Bernie, and it probably hurt Bernie. And so that was and the reason it was successful is because progressives and liberals had helped normalize this Russiagate playbook, where we're just going to reflexively believe whatever the national security state tells us, especially if it's about Russia, and we're naturally going to see Russia as this boogeyman, this monster under the bed that can install a president in the White House, and we have to fear whatever we're told is Russia's agenda. It's classic McCarthyism, but it's worked. It's been successful.
Look here, you and I both know that what you need is some Libertarian Institute things, like shirts and sweatshirts and mugs and stickers to put on the back of your truck, and to give to your friends too that say Libertarian Institute on them, so that everyone will know the origins of your oppositional defiant disorder and where they can listen to all the best podcasts. So here's what you do. Go to libertasbella.com and look at all the great Libertarian Institute stuff they've got going there. Find the ad in the right-hand margin at libertarianinstitute.org. libertasbella.com. You guys check it out. This is so cool. The great Mike Swanson's new book is finally out. He's been working on this thing for years. And I admit I haven't read it yet. I'm going to get to it as soon as I can, but I know you guys are going to want to beat me to it. It's called Why the Vietnam War, Nuclear Bombs and Nation Building in Southeast Asia, 1945 through 61. And as he explains on the back here, all of our popular culture and our retellings and our history and our movies are all about the height of the American war there in, say, 1964 through 1974. But how did we get there? Why is this all Harry Truman's fault? Find out in Why the Vietnam War by the great Mike Swanson. Available now. Well, and of course, he wasn't man enough to debunk it all along, which he should have. He should have said, everybody, you know me. I'm so left, I'm independent of the Democrats in the Senate, and I'm no Trump guy, but I'm telling you, I'm not impressed by the CIA and the FBI's case here so far. He should have been saying that and citing you all along anyway, and not because the truth is the truth, and that's important, and then that would have helped him, because then when they came out and said that against him, he could have said, oh, yeah, right. We all saw this coming from a million miles away, just like you did. And because I remember in real time that you guys were predicting this. And when it happened, you said, see, we told you this was what was going to happen. Especially that was Blumenthal's narrative, right, at the time. But that
Absolutely.
could have been Sanders' narrative. But he didn't do it, you know?
He had said he went a lot. It's so sad because what did these emails show? These emails showed that Bernie's rival, the Clinton campaign, were biased against him. And not only did these emails show that, then shortly after that, Clinton lost. So you have both a record of electoral failure where they lost to this reality TV show host, and you had these revelations that they were trying to undermine Bernie. So you had a perfect opportunity for Bernie to like take the reins of the party and say, these people, they lost to Trump and they tried to sabotage, our movement and through rigging and bias. Instead, what did he do? He propped up the narrative that was used by the Clinton wing to distract everybody from what these emails actually showed and from the lesson of their loss, which is that their legacy was a failure. he propped up the Russiagate narrative instead. So basically, he helped prop up the thing the Clinton campaign was doing to avoid talking about the embarrassing emails and talking about their embarrassing loss to Trump. It's so it's pathetic, really. And at the time, I thought maybe Bernie was making it. He was like it was a strategic calculation, because if he goes anti-Russiagate, then they're going to just accuse him of being a Putin puppet too, and he doesn't want that to undermine his chances. But really, if he had done what as you had said he could have done, he would have really taken a huge safety blanket away from the Clinton campaign. He could have really charted a different course, where instead of trying to undermine Trump with this dumb Russia conspiracy thing, you actually try to undermine Trump by putting forth a different political agenda. And you're not normalizing this playbook of using the national security state, which naturally made a lot of Trump supporters defensive and support Trump, and being like naturally protective of him, and like which thus kind of closed people off from hearing any kind of dissenting point of view. So it was a perfect storm that totally benefited only one party, which is the Clinton campaign. And it's just so sad that Bernie went along with that.
Yeah. Part of what you're talking about too, and in the background of this whole discussion, now that we're a few years out, looking back on this, as this now relatively short period of time that we're no longer in the middle of, this whole Russiagate scandal, it's just unavoidable how completely silly and ridiculous this thing is. And I remember I got this wrong, but I was telling my audience in the summer of 2016 that this Russia thing can't last, because, look at who you're talking about. You're talking about Donald Trump. He's a megastar, they call him, right? Like bigger than a superstar. He's as famous as all the famous people ever combined at the same time. He's a real estate tycoon from Manhattan, and he happens to be probably the most transparent individual person as far as just looking at him and knowing what he's thinking and what he's about in every kind of way that you could imagine. This is a guy, I first saw him on Robin Leach, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, in like 1983 or something. He's been in 10,000 cameos, right? Like he's the most, anyway. The idea that somehow he's a commie agent from the Kremlin or whatever, and I know that they're not the commies anymore, but ultimately it's the same Alger Hiss type scenario as what they're trying to push here, and it's still the Kremlin and all of that. And it just seemed to me at the time in the summer that this is so ridiculous, and it didn't stop him from winning, right? He won the election anyway, and then, but boy, was I proven wrong that it was going to somehow peter out, and I guess they had to double and triple down just because of what trouble they'd be in since he won anyway. And they had done all of this to try to set him up in the summer. So now they had to, that was one of the main reasons, I guess, they had to continue this whole thing. But just, anyway, back to the question, just how crazy it is now. And look at this story where, if it was Schwarzenegger, if he'd been born in America and Schwarzenegger ran, and they go, oh yeah, no, he's a secret agent of the Russians or the Chinese or whoever, you would say, no, he's not. He's the guy from the movies. We all know him. You know what I mean? You don't need to know every business deal to know that Schwarzenegger is not compromised by some foreign power. Same thing with Trump. The whole thing is just crazy. And to think that they got away with perpetuating this thing for 3 years straight. And even to this day, I see you fighting with ridiculous Marcy Wheeler on Twitter, still insisting on this garbage. It's just incredible.
Well, it's funny. You look at media throughout the Russiagate thing, and people like Marcy were on MSNBC regularly, even on progressive outlets like Democracy Now!, My Old Home. Whereas my point of view, which was just simply, all I was doing was looking at the available evidence. Like, we get these indictments so often, and we get court filings. So there was a lot of available evidence, and all of it consistently showed that there was nothing to support any of this conspiracy stuff. But the dominant media narrative was that there really was something there. Mueller was closing in. So media across the board just featured all these conspiracy theorists like Marcy Wheeler, people who were ignoring and distorting what was actually in the available facts to spin it into this grand conspiracy tale. And voices like mine, which were, just pointing out that there was nothing there. It was like, I got to be in the Nation magazine to debunk this stuff, but that's kind of the closest this really got to the mainstream, and it's so ridiculous to look back on, because it was so, as you say, it was so stupid. This idea that the president is a Russian puppet blackmail victim, how that was like the dominant belief of like grown-up adults who are all educated and work at these well-established media outlets. But that's what it was. That's what was in style, and it speaks to how you can't just understand politics, based on like the merits of arguments, but there's a lot of social psychology involved, and this was the club to be in, and this was the way to be. So that's how so many people acted. And you look, even now, this Michael Sussman story. So after wall-to-wall coverage of every single Russiagate development for more than 2 years, every court filing, every court hearing, every possible bombshell would dominate the news cycle. Now this Michael Sussman indictment, where for the first time we have an actual evidence of a conspiracy, it just goes in the other direction, showing that the conspiracy was the one that concocted the fake Trump-Russia conspiracy theory. Look how it's getting covered now. The MSNBC has barely touched it. If you look at like Rachel Maddow, who was do Russiagate every single night, she covered the story by covering it the night before the indictment came out. So she was doing it based off of a New York Times story, which was based on leaks from the Sussman camp. So Rachel Maddow spun it the way the Sussman camp wanted the story to look, thereby avoiding all the damning information that came out in the indictment the next day. And you look at places like Democracy Now! And whatever, you can go to every liberal progressive outlet. They're ignoring it, even though we have evidence for the first, like in a court indictment of a conspiracy involving the Clinton campaign to manufacture what was once the biggest story in the country for more than 2 years. It's just our media has become incredibly partisan and dishonest across a wider spectrum in ways that I haven't seen before.
Yeah. And look, I mean, the blowback from this is already legendary. And this has been going on for 30 years. But this is, Russiagate is not an insignificant part of the overall massive failure of America's centrist liberal establishment here.
Absolutely.
Along with their wars and along with the rest of this. They wonder why, for example, the arguments about the germ have become all so partisan. Well, geez, you're the same guys who lie about everything. So, I guess we're supposed to take your word for this on this, most important issue, and people just don't. And it isn't like they're wrong to not, right? When so much of the official pronouncements, even about the germ, not to get into specifics, but just, so much of that is wrong, even by their own standards when they later correct it and that kind of thing. That there's not a lot to believe in there, and especially in the aftermath of things like this. Things like pretending Saddam Hussein was making a nuke to attack your hometown with, in order to get into, these, further decades of war and things like this. And just the level of dishonesty. They just think that, it's all about messaging. You got to message to the people right. Like you're saying, social psychology. But there's blowback when people feel like they're being manipulated, but they don't take that into account. Where's that go in your little algorithm about how to correctly message what we're supposed to think and feel like? And now it's like really undermining their authority over everyone, which is, the good part. I'm sorry, I'm just ranting. Let me ask you a good question. What do you think might be the future of Durham's investigation here? More indictments? Are they going to make this guy squeal on somebody else and really build a thing here? Or this is just one last little kind of deal?
He's not going to squeal. There's no way, because he's there to do a job, which is, pursue the Clinton campaign agenda. And to get, I don't think there's just like a single count indictment on a false statement charge is not enough to get someone like him to squeal. So I don't expect that. I think you'll probably see. Well, you know what? Look, it's not good to predict, but if I had to, I would guess that you'll probably see maybe some more charges on this Alpha Bank thing, possibly more charges on giving false information to the FBI. maybe if they can prove that someone actually faked traffic between this Trump marketing server and Alpha Bank, and maybe you'll get them for that kind of computer fraud thing. But I think it's hard. It's a hard thing to bring criminal charges over because, I mean, either you get them on perjury, but otherwise, to me, this is just all just intelligence misconduct, and that can be accountability for that has to come in a public report, and that's what I'm really hoping comes out of this Durham thing, which we get an actual honest public report with no redactions, because so many of the reports so far have been redacted. I think the redacted parts will tell us from like the Mueller report and also from the Senate intelligence report, just will probably show more evidence that this thing was a scam. I think that's why they're redacted personally. But regardless, I hope that Durham gives us a report and that we're allowed to see it, and that we're allowed to especially see information on what led U.S. intelligence officials to conclude that Russia hacked the Democratic Party emails, gave them to WikiLeaks as part of this sweeping interference campaign to install Trump. What is the actual intelligence for that? Because I think there's every indication that there's nothing there, and that some of that was just basically embellished or even fabricated. And I want to see it. And the public has a right to see it, given how much this narrative dominated our politics for so long. So I hope that's the product of the Durham investigation, is a really comprehensive final report. And on the plus side, this indictment, look, it's one count on false statements. It could have just been one page, but it's 27 pages. And the narrative of the 27 pages is that the Trump-Russia collusion thing was the product of a scam. So hopefully that's a good sign that we'll get more reports and information like that from Durham in the coming future.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, everybody, the entire 27-page charging document is linked in Aaron's piece there at the Gray Zone and at Maté, that's spelled like mate, Maté.substack.com. With Clinton lawyer charged, the Russiagate scam is now indicted. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you, Scott.
Really appreciate it.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.